Welcome to this special edition of the TDI podcast series, Suits and Boots, brought to you as part of TDI's Sustainability Strategic Partnership with Mining Indaba 2025. I'm Ashton Carter, CEO of TDI, and I'm joined today by two representatives from different parts of the mining industry who will be speaking at this year's Mining Indaba event in Cape Town. Over the course of this series of special edition podcasts, we'll be discussing the key themes of this year's event. Today's topic is about delivering effective net zero and just transition strategies, and we'll be exploring the dual requirements of a just economic transition in Africa and the climate imperative. How can mineral extraction catalyse inclusive economic growth on the continent? I'm delighted to be joined today by John Sloan, an economist with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, specializing in industrial policy and natural resources, focusing on harnessing mining for economic transformation. John has worked for more than 13 years with the United Nations in Addis Ababa, Beirut, and New York, covering other topics such as trade, conflict, and development financing. Also joined today by Nkandu Beltz, who is the founding director of Beltz Mining, which is an Australian public unlisted company, which owns mineral exploration rights in Zambia. Nkandu is, I think, by all witnessing a reputation, an entrepreneur and visionary with a background in business and communications. She's won several awards throughout her career for her ethical approach to business and her dedication to community engagement. Thank you, Nkandu and John, for joining us today. So, let's start our conversation by reflecting on the policy initiatives in Africa today. What are, from your points of view, the policy? What are the opportunities that policymakers are seizing at the moment across the continent? What sort of activity are we seeing to develop value chains, critical mineral value chains, and press for local industrialization or sustainable economic development? Perhaps we could start with you, John, from an economic analysis point of view.
Yes, so thank you very much for having us today. We see that this issue of mineral-based development, of harnessing the opportunities presented by the global green energy transition is very clearly being prioritized in the region at the moment. We see this in our consultations, in our discussions, our events. Really, all the attention is on this, and for good reason. Mineral-based industrialization had indeed been a priority on policymakers' agendas for a long time. But I think for a number of reasons that I'm sure we'll get into today, it's recognized as more feasible than perhaps in the past. And a main priority now is to ensure that this current or forthcoming so-called critical minerals boom is different than past minerals booms and actually serves the region's priorities for inclusive socioeconomic development. We see very tangible progress both in mineral sectors, but also in related areas. For example, regionally with the African Continental Free Trade Area, a number of cross-border agreements and initiatives to build value chains to move together into higher value activities. And I think one clear example of this prioritization is the Africa Green Minerals Strategy, which is being championed by the AU, AFDB, and others. We as the UN are also involved. This builds on the Africa Mining Vision, which was signed in 2009, but sort of brings it up to date to today. What is going on? Where is all the attention? And how do we, harness what priorities are within the region, but also from outside? Which minerals are in demand? And how do we shift that to which minerals are most beneficial for the region's own priorities and own agenda? And finally, we do see that global arrangements on this subject, such as at the UN, there was a panel convened last year by the Secretary General looking at energy transition minerals. And we did see that priorities of Africa were quite well represented on this. So there is a good reason for optimism at the moment.
I'll just pick up on one thing you said there. You talked about, you said the so-called critical minerals, and you also talked about the priorities for Africa. Are the critical minerals in Northern Europe and in North America and in Europe, are they the same critical minerals that are the priorities for Africa, for the continent? So are we aligned on what is a critical mineral?
That is the issue exactly. I think a big guiding question behind the Africa Green Minerals Strategy is critical for whom? When most actors around the globe use the term critical minerals, they mean minerals that are critical for the global energy transition, namely copper, cobalt, manganese, graphite, minerals that go into the batteries, the wind turbines, and so forth. So it's not to say the region says, no, these aren't critical for us. The region is saying what minerals are critical for our own mineral-based development trajectory, and importantly, to feed into plugging our own energy gaps. So these include many of those minerals, but they also extend to others, phosphates, minerals that are used for hydropower, others that maybe the globe doesn't focus on in this critical mineral discussion, but are nonetheless extremely critical for countries in the region.
And wouldn't steel be a key element in industrialization?
Absolutely. Steel, aluminum, bauxite, some of the minerals we saw playing a big role during the previous commodity super cycle, which are left off of some lists. The global lists of critical minerals vary greatly, right? I think the UK's list has maybe 34. The IEA has 5 or 6, so it varies significantly. And a lot of those that you're alluding to are indeed on the Africa critical mineral list.
Nkandu, from your point of view, of course, copper, I think everybody has agreed that copper is a critical mineral. We need that to transmit the electrons for the electrification of the economy, and also its biggest customer is in construction. But from your point of view, as an entrepreneur with 2 projects underway, how are you seeing the policy landscape, and how's that assisting entrepreneurs such as you?
Well, thank you very much for that, Ashton. I will take a local and Zambian point of view on this, and this is based on my observations. What we're observing is that the Zambian government has recognized opportunities presented by the energy transition, mostly in the copper sector. As everyone knows, Zambia is the 2nd largest producer of copper in Africa. So to develop value chains and also promote local industrialization, and policymakers have implemented various initiatives. And some of these are, for example, the National Industrial Policy, which aims to promote industrialization and economic diversification. And also the government has identified the copper sector as a priority area for development. So we are seeing government actually investing in early stage exploration as well, because if we don't explore, we don't find. We're also seeing programs like the Linkages program, where they have launched these projects to promote local content as well as value addition in the mining sector. And then lastly, it's investment in infrastructure. And this is not just from a Zambian point of view, but we're also seeing infrastructure development across the SADC region. So the government has invested in infrastructure development, including transportation networks and energy generation. And we are also seeing that some of this is snowballing to the Lubito Corridor project, which is currently underway.
You picked up on one thing which I talk about a lot, which is this early stage exploration companies and the juniors who take the high risk to define these reserves, take resources and define them into reserves. And that seems to me a place which is starved of capital. How should policymakers, and what's your experience in Zambia for how policymakers can enable and facilitate the path to identifying these reserves in the continent?
Well, I think for starters, we should be looking at collaboration, because investing in exploration, it's very expensive. It's so high risk. One of the challenges that we face as explorers is access to data as well as access to capital. So when the government adds to their budget exploration costs, it makes it a little bit cheaper for us. And then that way we are able to focus on areas where we know we might mostly likely to find something, but also collaborating with other countries and a lot of other industry leaders, with advanced technologies that can come in and help in terms of mapping out the country. We are seeing companies like Cobalt, for example, with their AI technologies, which makes a massive difference to the exploration industry. So it will be a collaborative approach in order for us to get to mining on a national scale.
John, something that you mentioned beforehand was the priorities for Africa, and that the African continent also has a priority list for critical minerals. Think a little bit about the minerals that are needed for energy, and of course that's a pull from North America, Europe and other parts of the world, is to get hold of those minerals that can help in electrification. In your kind of work on the industrialization of Africa, and of course I think we'll all agree that that's the development objective, or one of the development objectives, energy is going to play a significant part. So what contribution can these minerals that we're talking about here in Africa play in advancing Africa's ambitions for cleaner and cheaper energy? Or should we be looking at the coal reserves that they have and that may use that for industrialization? And have we got a bit of a contradiction here?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think when the issue is being viewed more holistically, right, from a national and regional development perspective, the role of critical minerals at the end of the day is, as you're discussing, to feed into the country's own energy generation, energy supply, energy grid, to reach those 600 plus million people in the region who lack connection to reliable electricity grids. So this is sort of the ultimate objective. And this also serves multiple purposes, for example, as a signal to investors, to the international business community who, as we are trying to entice them in to invest in manufacturing, value addition, battery production and so forth. They also want to see that these products will not just be manufactured or assembled in the region and then re-exported, but investors want to see a vibrant and growing local market, local demand, that it makes sense to produce products adjacent to. And for this reason, highlighting the role of mineral-based energy products for domestic energy consumption today, and especially down the road as populations grow and connectivity grows, this makes business sense, and it makes social and national development priority sense. I think when it comes to the trade-offs between clean or renewable energy and fossil fuels, the region has been quite clear that it has contributed very negligibly to global climate change, right? Less than 4% of historic carbon emissions. And yet it's one of the most vulnerable regions in the world, whether it's the increased deforestation, rising sea levels, prolonged droughts, and so forth. So the region has been clear that while it will move into clean energy when it makes sense, and it does make sense in most cases, both regarding the assets on hand, right? Rivers, water, solar radiation, biomass, but also it makes business sense as it links with a green industrialization strategy. But there is still a role in many African countries for, especially in the short term, a transitional fossil fuel based energy source, just for the imperative of industrialization, of catch up, of extending energy grids to those who lack them.
And Nkandu, with your projects, thinking both of the energy inputs and also the customers for your copper product, the energy inputs are, how is the energy generated? Is it any part renewable, or have we got captured coal, captured carbon projects there?
Well, Zambia has been very much dependent on hydro. So 85, I think about 85% of our power is hydro. And we have seen a massive chronic shortage of power due to the drought that we have been facing over the last few years. And this has been not only for Zambia, but also Zimbabwe and South Africa. So when we're talking about renewable energy, we also need to focus on the infrastructure, because what we're finding is that even the guys that are using solar, we do not have enough infrastructure to get to the grid, which also becomes a massive problems for those people that are either trying to import power or generate power on their own. So we're working very hard to find other alternatives other than reliance on the hydro.
And in terms of the offtake, do you think that'll be going internationally, or generally should we be looking for the minerals that are developed in Africa to be going into the African market and contribute to the decarbonization of Africa?
Well, I think there's an opportunity to do both. We can look at international opportunities as well as looking at what we can produce locally. Opportunities are there, and it's just a matter of how we leverage our resources. As John mentioned earlier, the population in Africa is very young, and in about 10 years' time, all these young people will need jobs. So there's an opportunity there to look at infrastructure development. They will need homes, they will need jobs. And this is a really good opportunity for us to look at how we can collaborate on an international platform, as well as invest in these green industrialization ambitions that we have. And
you mentioned earlier the linkages program. When I started in this world and sustainable development of mining companies employed quite considerable workforces. but the tide of automation is coming to our industrial shores very fast. And I feel that mining companies can no longer make a promise about employment. So what are the opportunities then for ensuring that communities around mines and the population, especially this 60% of the under 25-year-olds in Africa, will benefit from mining directly, or do we need to look to more indirect linkages?
Well, I suppose it comes back to the value addition and this value supply chain that everyone has been talking about, is how do we make sure that, we do not export just dirt out of Africa. So by creating those, processing plants, smelters, and everything that needs for us to add value to it, I think that becomes a much more beneficial situation for both the locals and the international community. So I come from Dola myself, which is the copper belt of Zambia. We left the country because, my dad had lost his job. So that was in the early 90s, mid 90s. But Ndola is an industrial town. So there's quite a lot of things that can be manufactured and that can add value to our mining sector. And as we know, the Copper Belt province of Zambia, hosts quite a significant amount of copper. So it does not make sense that we are exporting material that is not value added into from our country and then going to the ports either via Tanzania or Beira or somewhere in South Africa. So I think there's an opportunity there to create those community jobs and work with communities.
I'd really like to hear, and John, from your point of view, I'd really like to hear your view on this. In some sense, there's been incredible growth in the world because of globalization, and that rests on the idea of comparative advantage. So you do what you're best at compared to other countries. Some people would say that the race for downstream of critical minerals in the value chain has already been won by other countries. And also, should we be encouraging protectionism, especially in this market, which is very much a global market? So I'd love to hear your kind of critical thinking on whether this idea of beneficiation and value addition in African countries is actually a plausible strategy.
Yeah, I think firstly, when we at the UNECA discuss value addition, we look at it from all angles. Of course, downstream processing, beneficiation, moving into final products is a very central element of value addition. But I think it's somewhat developed into a state where when we discuss value addition, it's implied that this means downstream. We've done a number of studies on some of the upstream value-added opportunities, inputs to the mining process. And we're talking about high-value job-creating activities here, whether it's in chemicals, blasting media, and so forth. We did a study on the gold mining upstream sector in ECOWAS in West Africa, and we looked at the immense opportunity to create jobs and raise revenues just by investing in upstream activities. So overall, to say that there are a number of ways to add value and create jobs around mining. Of course, the case of Australia is a key example of that. But we still look at opportunities at all directions of linkages, and this does include downstream. And indeed, I think when you look at data on global mineral value chains, and you see a very large majority for certain minerals, for many minerals, in fact, being captured in a few specific countries, namely China, and also when you look at the capital requirements, the energy requirements to really meaningfully move into some downstream sectors, this does act as a bit of a deterrent, or it makes some question whether this should be a priority. I think our approach is that it is still a very viable, very possible area. I'm from Detroit personally, and if you look back 120 years ago, the global discourse on the automotive sector was that the U.S. had captured the value chain to such an extent that countries such as Japan and others shouldn't even bother getting into it. And of course, I know there are differences, but we see how that was definitely not the case. But beyond that, at a small level, at a grassroots level, some of the initiatives we see going on, and a big opportunity is presented by battery production, both the final battery products as well as cells, casings, anodes and cathodes, and so forth. These are areas that are feasible and that the business community is interested in, and that does send a signal that there are downstream possibilities that are reachable.
And you mentioned in your opening remarks about cross-border opportunities, and I've been working a little bit on regional integration, cooperation, and looking at economic corridors. And this is something which isn't new, of course, and it's been discussed quite a lot. And in terms of critical minerals, there's been investment in this. Has that got a future? Is that somewhere where we should be focusing?
Absolutely. I think there is, or at least there's a growing consensus that mineral-based value addition will not succeed by one country alone, that regional value chains are absolutely essential due to a number of reasons. I'd mentioned earlier about the need for sort of a market size, a large market size for investors to see as a signal and come in and say, okay, this is something we are interested in. One country's economy as an ultimate consumer downstream of the products may not be large enough on its own, but when you pool countries' markets together, this is significant. Also on the production side, on the assets, on the labor force, this is significant. Nkandu mentioned some of the energy issues being faced by Zambia, being faced by other countries. Well, we hear that the pooling of energy supplies, having cross-border grids, is absolutely essential in redirecting energy to where it might be needed most. We see that in SADC region. We also see that here in East Africa, where we are based. And some of the most exciting initiatives, for example, in battery production, this agreement between the DRC and Zambia to move into precursor production. This again is not realistic by one country on its own anywhere in the world. But when countries cooperate together, we see immense potential.
Nkandu, the responsibility for making this happen and financing this transition, this upstream linkages, whose responsibility is it? Or maybe I should phrase the question, what is the responsibility of the private sector and entrepreneurs such as yourself, which obviously have primary responsibility for your projects? What part should you play in this?
Well, thank you very much. That's a very tough question, Assheton. I think in terms of our responsibility, we are all responsible for this. As John mentioned, when we dealing with our investors as well as us who are entrepreneurs. It has to be a joint collaboration in order for us to solve these issues, because at the end of the day, we all win. That community participation, not only community from a local level, but that international community and collaboration is what's very much needed. And we're seeing that people are coming together, companies are coming together and having this joint or financing projects or programs coming together to help. That's I think that's where we should be going.
And of course, at your projects, having a social license to operate is critical to the smooth operation of your projects. And the local community play in part of that. How do we, we've had a lot of these discussions at the policy level, but how do we include what's the obligations of both policymakers and companies such as yourselves to engage with mining communities in this youthful population in Africa?
Thank you. I think one, by starting to ensure that there is that community participation. So the establishment of community liaison committees, for example, to facilitate dialogue and benefit sharing. What we're seeing is, for example, the traditional custodians of the land, most of the time, they're not invited to the table unless somebody is seeking consent to explore or to mine in that area. We need to do better in terms of community engagement with both the custodians of the land as well as the governments, and then the upskilling and training as well. We're seeing that there's quite a lot of gaps at the moment. There's quite a massive shortage of geologists, for example. So how do we identify and train the local communities for the mining of the future? And then also focus on the skills that are important for local value addition and also economic diversification. Automation, of course, will come into play when we're talking about mining, and this will also probably lead to job losses. But then there's also an opportunity or an upside to all of this, where we can start skilling or upskilling programs to support the workers transitioning into new roles, as well as encouraging mining companies to adapt socially responsible practices and prioritizing local employment.
John, talking about from an economist's point of view and on the skilling and the upskilling, should policy be looking at upskilling in the industry to train more geologists, or should we be looking at alternative industries and that diversification? And if so, which industries should they be trained for? My own experience in the UK, going back to the Mrs. Thatcher days, Margaret Thatcher days, and when the coal mines were closing down, and transferring those skills into other parts of the economy was more difficult than that Conservative government at the time imagined. What's the future in terms of the skilling of the African workforce?
Yeah, I think, skills gaps, skills issues are very frequently listed as a big constraint, whether in the mining sector to sourcing more locally and adding more value downstream, but also, across other sectors and other businesses operating in the region. I think regarding which industries to focus on in the provision of skills, in general, whether it's on skills policies, fiscal incentives, tax policies, mining countries have for some time developed, very good policies based on their experiences in the sector. Now, implementation then ends up being an issue. What are the realities on the ground? Do the skills provided end up actually matching those, demanded or required by the private sector? This is a good question. But when we're looking at value addition, we're trying to support countries in moving their incentive structures towards new areas, towards manufacturing, high value skills, and so forth. And again, in some of our interactions, both with multinational firms as well as local firms, we do see those areas for potential and where some very directed government policy could help. For example, and I'm not sure if this is in line with what Nkandu sees in her operations, but some mining firms have told us that they would in fact prefer to source locally, to hire more locally, because this would cut down on their costs, on their import costs, on their emissions of bringing in products, on their salaries of bringing in foreign workers. And it's also good for their image. It's good for their PR to be more locally integrated. But some of them have said to us it's somewhat on the issue of skills and quality and capacity, but moreover on reliability. Reliability that local suppliers will deliver on time, that they have, the workforce on hand to be able to be flexible to the needs of the mining sector. So they've, reported that they would be very willing to be more engaged in the local economic ecosystem if some certain pressure points are alleviated through policy. And I think every actor in this ecosystem bears responsibility for helping to improve this. We see that the most successful education and training programs globally are based on whether it's some sort of education board or training board where firms, governments, education institutes come together and determine where the very clear skills gaps are and what needs to be done.
And, one way we've been trying to look at this in our own work is through the idea of integrated mineral development landscapes. So just as you're describing, there might be a core activity in mineral development, but then we need to develop the ancillary and auxiliary industries, which can bring in those local linkages. But that requires investment as well from development agencies and governments. And thinking that we need to then crowd in other investors from other sectors which might not traditionally have been involved in mining, such as the development banks and such as impact investors, to build that capacity. Is that something that you've been looking at as well or considering?
Yes, very much so in a couple of ways. One, there's a lot of expertise out there in mining in other regions, but also in other sectors within the region. I mean, colleagues of mine have pointed out that there are extremely experienced African mining engineers, geoscientists, and so forth working for the big majors, the big global firms in other regions. So there's clearly a talent pool out there, both within the region and externally. And it's an issue of increasing that critical mass of activity in the region to attract, as many as possible within Africa and elsewhere. I think there's also a great role being played by development banks and export-import banks, for example, African Export-Import Bank, African Development Bank, in signaling that some of these investments, not only in the mining and industries themselves, but in infrastructure and in education, right? Two very key inputs to a successful mineral industrial value chain, that these investments are sound and will produce returns in the long run, and also acting as guarantors to some extent, on bringing in businesses, whether it's to set up shop in special economic zones or to be directly involved in the construction of new infrastructure, provision of it, there are a lot of different and actors who are bringing their own expertise and comparative advantages on that.
And Nkandu, have you explored partnerships with donors, funders, financiers, looking at the kind of non-core activities around your projects?
Yes, we have. So we are working with a number of organizations. So we're not only from the exploration side of things, but then also trying to tackle the energy poverty that we are critically facing in Zambia. But I would also like to get to the point that John brought about, that training in terms of job creation. So when I look at mining and we're looking at jobs in the mining sector and training, we're looking at it from, mining has got the finance component as well. So we're working with a lot of different financiers from all sorts of background, and then technology. And then there's the legal side of things, and then there's the social side of things, and then there's the ESG, and, so many. So in a nutshell, we can see that mining provides a lot of jobs, not just for people on site or people at the labs. It's something that actually does develop our communities. So we are looking at, or we have taken a holistic approach to see, who can we collaborate with in these spaces in terms of finance, legal, social activities, and making sure that, we're not only working on that particular site in Wekera, but we are developing a whole entire community. So there's a lot of opportunities to collaborate with, a lot of financing houses that some of them are not just particularly interested in sinking money into the ground, but also looking at what value can we add to what they're trying to do.
So we talked a little bit about technology and automation of the mining sector, and we've acknowledged there that might lead to job losses, but also there are other ways to gain jobs. But thinking about technology again, what are some of the positive things that you see that this rapid advance in technology applications, including artificial intelligence, can play in the mining sector and for the kind of global goal to reduce carbon emissions?
Well, thank you very much. So technological advances can facilitate the reduction of carbon emissions across the supply chain by improving the energy efficiency in the mining and processing operations. We are seeing this with companies like Nextore here in Australia, which I sit on. I'm a director of Nextore in Zambia. And we're doing this by reducing a significant amount of time and energy in ore sorting. So our clients, by the time they finish their ore sorting, they'll be able to tell, which ore can actually go into the plant and which one is, and what is waste immediately. So that also reduces the amount of money spent. And I think implementing renewable energy sources such as solar and wind power, enhancing transportation efficiency through electrification and automation. We can also promote sustainable land use practice and reforestation efforts. Yeah. Again, we have seen these examples, and it shows that it can be done in Africa. And the other thing is that the viability of green technology in Zambia's industrialization path is improving. We have seen the cost of green technology is decreasing and making it more accessible to African countries like Zambia. And also Zambia can leverage on green technologies to support its goals, such as promoting, sustainable agricultural practice as well, because where there's mining, agriculture also falls into place. And lastly, I would say the international cooperation and partnerships can provide critical support, especially for Zambia as we transition to the low carbon economy. So yeah, definitely we have to embrace the technology advancement.
And John, I mean, technology has disrupted many industries historically, and everything you read in the newspapers will give you the idea that we are in for some revolutions in different industries, even in industry as, based on commodities such as mining. And we've heard about kind of how sensors might completely transform the efficiency of sorting good grade ore from waste. How do you see technology playing a part in mining in the mineral value chain?
So we've seen how technology can bring, some quick wins in the mining sector and other sectors, whether it's bringing in renewable energy sources, local grids, solar-based grids, reducing, dependence on costly fossil fuel imports, things like that. But we also see, very low cost but innovative green approaches for factories for manufacturing. Here in Ethiopia, in their light manufacturing parks, they've just looked at simple things, whether it's window design for natural lighting or water reuse, technologies that can really transform the cost of operating. And then when we look at technology for the longer run in the mining and mineral-based industry sectors, it has the potential to change the entire sector and demand for some of the mineral outputs. For example, a lot of people are talking about recycling, right? And the potential for this to reduce demand for new mineral products in the long run. This is very good from a circular economy perspective. And that's an angle that's often championed. But as it stands, a lot of this recycling is very either energy intensive or chemical intensive or manual labor, very taxing. So in this context, it's important to see how African countries can harness these advances so that they don't adversely affect job creation. On the trade-offs between innovation and job creation in general, the question is what jobs will be created and where. Whether it's technology or automation, this tends to create more jobs at a macro level. But at a micro level, there will be winners and losers, both regarding sectors and locationally. And here's where countries are very proactively looking, again, beyond mining alone. The products for the green economy will only increase in demand as time goes on. And even in activities such as retrofitting, environmental work at mining sites, this is a growing area. We have a study at ECA that noted that green renewable infrastructure will create twice as many jobs per dollar invested as investment in fossil fuel infrastructure. So all this points to how a more forward-thinking policy when it comes to employment, job creation, and technology has the potential to increase those jobs and those higher income jobs for the region's young population.
Almost every conversation that I've had with corporate leaders, entrepreneurs, and policymakers and ministers around mining and Africa, the topic of ESG standards comes up over and over again. And really the sentiment is, or the question that I guess is raised, is these standards, which are often set in Europe, the Brussels effect, or in the US, aren't necessarily sympathetic to the development pathways in Africa and are set with the intention to protect corporates in those home countries, but not think about the development needs in the continent, and are thus sometimes inappropriate. What do you experience, Nkandu, on these ESG standards that are expected to be followed by corporations like yours, companies like yours? Are they appropriate? Is it a beneficial thing generally, or is this creating two different speeds?
Thank you very much for that question. Well, it is quite confusing because there's different frameworks and different benchmarks. And I think it is very important to have a global ESG framework that could possibly work for, every country. I don't know if that is possible. But balancing the external standards with African development needs as well needs to be put in context. One of the things that I would say is that we should probably encourage dialogue between external stakeholders and African governments. And again, Africa is a massive continent, so it will be challenging to find a solution that caters to everyone. So maybe in this case, we may have to consider context-specific ESG standards, and by maybe prioritizing capacity building and technical assistance. It is a very difficult one, especially for explorers at this stage.
And John?
Yeah, I think sometimes there are mixed signals that are being sent to African countries in the mining sector and regarding emissions. Just to take two pieces of legislation, one being the EU Critical Raw Materials Act, which is seeking to, amongst other goals, source more minerals that are needed for energy transition products. And extend opportunities for value chains within the EU and elsewhere. So really a mining enabling act. Same time, we have the carbon border adjustment, which is setting requirements on what's coming into the EU trading bloc and how it was produced and the emissions used in their production. So the juxtaposition here is you could reach a point where, cobalt, manganese, and so forth is needed from Africa to be imported to the EU, but depending on how it was mined and the processes that led to its transport and ultimate export, it might not meet the carbon border adjustment requirements. So these are some, issues that I think, as Nkandu mentioned, need to be ironed out through more dialogue, more discussion on how this is exactly going to work. And I think they do present a lot of opportunities. For example, the Raw Materials Act caps the percent of any one segment of the mining value chain that can come from any one country into the EU. And what this does is opens up an opportunity to other regions to step into that value chain, because African countries have made clear no one country or no region alone can supply, whether it's the raw materials or the finished products, to meet global demand for batteries, electric vehicles, wind turbines, if the projections hold, as they stand. Not the EU, not China, no one on their own. We need cooperation. We need value chains to be global and regional in order to, extend these opportunities, but really as a win-win.
Well, thank you so much for these insights. And maybe you just finish on a final thought, Nkandu and John. Who do you think should get the best deal in Africa from the energy transition, and why?
Okay, I will start. I think I believe that African countries, with a combination of strong governance and strategic planning and natural resources, will be well positioned to benefit from the energy transition. So I think the best winners will probably be South Africa, Morocco, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Zambia. The reason why I've put Zambia in there is we're looking at the copper reserves and the favorable business environment. That's, an attractive destination for investment and in the energy transition. And also with strategic planning and investment, Zambia could capitalize on the growing demand of copper and other critical minerals. So these countries will need to navigate complex geopolitical as well as economic dynamics to ensure that they get the best deal for their energy transition. However, with careful planning and strategic investment and collaboration with international partners, they can position themselves for success in the emerging low-carbon economy. The world is becoming so small, so I think there is some light at the end of the tunnel. It's good news.
Africa will be a clear winner from this critical minerals boom and the global energy transition, and specifically regional blocs stand to gain significantly if they can be well organized in their industrial policies, in their trade policies. Overall, the region needs a regional approach in order to stand the best chance for success. This involves having a unified voice to exercise the region's bargaining power. It's one thing to have a critical mass of these very important minerals, but it's another to be able to collectively exercise this bargaining power. And this will extend even up to the G20 membership of the region through South Africa. And it's through this regional element that assets can be pooled, that regional value chains can really be established. And overall, the region should and must continue to be a leader on this issue globally. When I attend global events, other regions seek to emulate the Africa mining vision, and they look to it as sort of a very landmark document in regionally, getting countries together and galvanizing mineral-based development. And we need the forthcoming Africa Green Mineral Strategy to similarly be a landmark for the priorities of mineral-producing countries and regions.
Excellent. This concludes today's TDI Sustainability Suits and Boots podcast. I'd like to thank our speakers all for joining us today. For our audience, please check out the rest of TDI Sustainability series of Mining Indaba podcasts on our Suits and Boots podcast series through our website. Until next time, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you, or some of you I hope, at the Mining Indaba in Cape Town in February.